This is what renting furniture with Feather looks like. Pieces that fit your style and your space, and cost less than your monthly phone bill. Oh, and did we mention delivery and assembly included? Feather. Start renting at livefeather.com.
Ladies and gentlemen, Alvin Bishop, you know what he told me just now? I can't say it to you. But he said he was screwing up, and I don't think so. So give him a big hand, Alvin Bishop. I don't think so at all. I think all the cats was playing wonderful. Don't you think so? Come on, give it to them. The cats are doing it because they feel like doing it.
That is the unmistakable voice of blues legend B.B. King working the crowd during an April 15th, 1968 show at the Generation Club in New York City that also featured Jimi Hendrix, the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, Al Kooper, and others. The session, which would become known as the King's Jam on bootlegs, captured a moment in time in rock and roll and American history. I'm Troy L. Smith, you're listening to CLE Rocks, and this is the story behind that epic night. To understand just how extraordinary the 1968 King's Jam was, you first have to understand the blues. In many ways, that starts with B.B. King. While artists like Blind Lemon Jefferson, T-Bone Walker, Ma Rainey, and others helped pioneer the genre, B.B. King quickly became the face of the blues as his career took off in the 1950s. King came from humble beginnings in Mississippi to become one of the genre's towering figures alongside the likes of Muddy Waters, John Lee Hooker, and Albert King.
Where I lived, the nearest studio was 100 and some miles. And where I lived, there was no music store. I had to buy strings for my guitar from the drugstore. And they only had one gauge. It was called Black Diamond. And that was all. And you get that. I hear there was stores that you could buy instruments, but the nearest place would have been 25 miles or more.
King's mesmerizing performances, specifically his iconic 1964 showcase at the Regal Theater in Chicago, would inspire a new generation of blues players, a list that included Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, and a young Paul Butterfield. Butterfield came up in Chicago as an aspiring blues harmonica player. He would eventually find mentorship from the great Muddy Waters, king of the Chicago blues scene. Butterfield would go on to create the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, a mixed-race act that would be a forum for standout players like Mike Bloomfield, Elvin Bishop, Gene Dinwiddie, and David Sanborn. Bishop recalls the magic of the Chicago blues scene at that time.
In Chicago was like hip-hop is now. It was the living music of choice of the black people. And there were hundreds of blues clubs, believe it or not, and everybody was into it. So that makes it a lot more fun. We were trying to play the kind of music we loved, and we were delighted to be making our living doing it, you know.
With artists like the Paul Butterfield Blues Band and Eric Clapton pushing the popularity of blues at the time, players began to migrate to other rock and roll venues around the country, which inevitably led them to New York's East Village. The Village had become a hotbed for jazz and folk music in the 1960s. Artists like Bob Dylan, Joni Mitchell, and Joan Baez could be seen performing at venues like Cafe A-Go-Go, Cafe Wha, and Folk City. The emergence of the East Village led several blues players to make their home in the city, including a young Jimi Hendrix, who Bishop recalls meeting for the first time when Paul Butterfield Blues Band was on tour.
We were playing at a club called the Cafe A-Go-Go. On the break in between shows, Bloomfield went over to another club in the village. He comes back, and his name was Jimmy James, and he wasn't Jimi Hendrix yet. There's a guy over at the Cafe Watt. His guitar playing sounds like cars crashing into trains and stuff.
Hendrix would become a guitar player like no other, taking the blues and hard rock to new experimental heights with the Jimi Hendrix Experience. By the late 1960s, he'd become a regular, whether in the crowd or on stage, at rock venues in New York. While the 1960s were consumed by the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War, the decade also became the greatest in music history. 1968 alone saw a series of landmark albums released, including the Jimi Hendrix Experience's Electric Ladyland, Van Morrison's Astral Weeks, the Beatles' White Album, the Rolling Stones' Beggar's Banquet, and a host of others. But the year would also be defined by violence and protest. January 1968 began with North Vietnam launching the Tet Offensive against the United States and South Vietnam. Then, on April 4th, the civil rights movement lost its greatest leader in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
I was deeply saddened last evening, as all men of goodwill must have been, by the senseless slaying of Dr. Martin Luther King.
The late Reverend was remembered by his widow, Coretta Scott King, in a statement to the press televised by WGN Chicago the day of his assassination.
My husband often told the children that if a man had nothing that was worth dying for, then he was not fit to live. He said also that it's not how long you live, but how well you live. He knew that at any moment his physical life could be cut short. And we faced this possibility squarely and honestly. My husband faced the possibility of death without bitterness or hatred. He knew that this was a sick society, totally infested with racism and violence, that questioned his integrity, maligned his motives, and distorted his views, which would ultimately lead to his death. And he struggled with every ounce of his energy to save that society from itself.
2 days before King's assassination, B.B. King began a residency at the Generation Club on West 8th Street in Greenwich Village. The venue would host a Wake for Martin Luther King concert on April 7th, featuring B.B. King, Buddy Guy, Janis Joplin, Joni Mitchell, Jimi Hendrix, and others. Just 8 days later, some of those artists would return for what would become known as the King's Jam. Such jam sessions were commonplace at the time, and when B.B. King played, every blues musician wanted in. That included a 24-year-old Al Kooper, who was living in New York, having just parted ways with his band Blood, Sweat, and Tears.
The Generation Club was a really good club. It was run by a guy named Barry Fay, and they had great people playing there. However, the best part would come when the late show was over, and they would clear out the audience, and all the musicians from around the village would then come in, and we would jam every night till sunup. So it didn't really matter who was playing there. Jimi Hendrix lived a few blocks away, and he lived about a block away from me. So I would always bump into him. So this was a very common thing in that it happened every night. But if BB would play there, then a lot of people would come down.
The lineup of who was on stage that night of April 15th, 1968 has been debated through the years, but this we know. B.B. King led a group that included Kooper on B3 organ, Jimi Hendrix on guitar, Paul Butterfield on harmonica, as well as the Paul Butterfield Blues members, Philip Wilson on drums, and Elvin Bishop on guitar and vocals. Bishop recalls that time in New York being one of a kind.
That was a jammin' time. It was, everything seems to be more calculated now, and the business people have more of a grip on the music than they did then. We were just kind of making it up as we went along, and especially in New York at that particular time, I remember lots of jam sessions with B.B. and Hendrix and Clapton and Allman Brothers, and just everybody just loved to jam, you know. And
also on stage that night was an 18-year-old college student named Howard Buzz Featon on bass.
And we have a young bass player, Buzzy, on the bass.
Featon, a student at Mannes School of Music, had recently auditioned for Elvin Bishop's new band. He didn't get the gig, but Bishop invited him to sit in on the jam session with B.B. King.
This is new. This is all new to me. I mean, I knew that there were these events happening in the West Village, but I was never part of it because I was in college, man, you know. So I brought my bass down there and went up on stage before anybody got there and was kind of tuning up and, you know, adjusting the amp and all that stuff. And when I turned around, there was all these, you know, I was standing on stage with Jimi Hendrix and B.B. King and Al Kooper, and I thought I died and went to heaven. It was funny, man. I was a horrible bass player. I was not a good bass player. I was actually a better guitar player than I was a bass player. When you're 18, you don't have a clue about playing rhythm or how to sit in the pocket or any of that. You know, it's all about play as loud, high, and fast as you possibly can until you're told to shut up. And that's basically was my mode. But, you know, I had played in a lot of ensembles, you know, as a classical player, orchestras, small chamber ensembles, and all that. So I knew about how to fit in, you know what I mean? That's what you learn as a classical player. You learn how to fit in. Those guys took me to school in a big hurry. I had drumsticks flying by my head, you know, and the drummer screaming at me, play rhythm, mother, you know? So I did learn about that because those guys were incredibly generous and supportive of me. They knew that I was over my head.
King, the night's elder statesman, would lead Featon and the others on a set that went until the sun came up. The list of songs included King's classic My Own Fault, Darlin', a cover of Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone, and several blues jams. The playful nature and familiarity between the musicians can be heard through King's voice, as he ridicules them for playing too loud as he speaks with the crowd.
Ladies and gentlemen, hey! Fellas, take it easy. Ladies and gentlemen, what could you... No, stop, baby. Don't do it like that. Just keep it soft. I'm on the radio now, you know. Since we started here, what year was it? What day was it? April the 2nd? April the 2nd? Since we started here, April the 2nd. All right. I'm gonna have to shoot some of these cats back behind me. I'm talking to you, Paul. Get the beer. I don't have one. All right.
A recording of the session exists because Hendrix never went anywhere without his 2-track Revox tape recorder, says Al Kooper.
When Hendrix would play, he would bring like a professional tape recorder with him and always record it for himself. He lived half a block from me, so we saw each other all the time, in the daytime and the nighttime and like that. And if one of us was playing, then the other one would come see him play. If I had a gig, he would always come, and if he had a gig, I would always go. So we got pretty friendly, and then I ended up playing on his album. I actually met him. I was the assistant stage manager at the Monterey Pop Festival. So I met him, and I have a terrific picture of, or a few pictures of the two of us at Soundcheck. And he invited me to play with him, and this was his debut in the United States, once he became Jimi Hendrix, with his two sidemen from England. And they had never played anywhere in America, and this was the first time that they played at Monterey.
At one point in the show, King finds himself amazed by Hendrix playing. Hendrix idolized King, but the blues disciple had become a master.
Jimi Hendrix, you're a stinker.
Jam sessions like the one at the Generation Club on April 15, 1968 wouldn't go on for much longer. New venues sprouted up, including the Fillmore East, which would host iconic concerts by the Allman Brothers, Grateful Dead, Aretha Franklin, and others. As the 1960s came to a close, intimate venues like the Generation Club became few and far between.
There was a time when things changed. The Fillmore took a lot of business away from those clubs. So when the Fillmore got big and people would go there all the time, because neither of those clubs could compete with the Fillmore, because the Fillmore held about 1,500 to 2,000 people, and these clubs held 200 people. So that was pretty much the difference.
The Generation Club would close later in 1968, but the building that housed it continued its historic legacy. Hendrix commissioned it to become what is now known as Electric Ladyland Studios in Greenwich Village, where he would spend the early months of the 1970s experimenting further with his guitar sound. Sadly, Hendrix would pass away in 1970. The other musicians on stage would go on to work with various other projects over the next few decades, with Butterfield passing away in 1987 and B.B. King dying in 2015 at the age of 89. King was remembered eloquently at that time by former Rolling Stones guitarist Bill Wyman in an interview with British television network ITN.
The most amazing thing about him and his band were they could thunder out like any band could, and then they'd just stop and just go to a whisper. Right to silence. You could hear a pin drop and he'd be playing doo, 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 doo. And then he'd sing, and then doo, doo, and then suddenly the band would start coming in, and it'd be, so there were these amazing dynamics which we all learned from. How to take a song and put it into a real simple down there, and then build it into a climax. And Otis Redding did it, we tried Little Tenderness and lots of people. And he was a master of that. And, what can I say about the guy? He was special. There won't be another one.
Buzz Feiten would end up replacing Elvin Bishop as guitarist in the Paul Butterfield Blues Band before working with other music legends like Greg Allman, Stevie Wonder, and Bob Dylan. But the music collaborations like the King's Jam still hold a special place in Feiten's heart, as they were about much more than just jamming together.
That was a really magical time. It was completely magical because there was all of this creative energy and all of this new stuff that nobody ever heard. That idea was really brand new. It was brand new. And it was kind of the same ethic that drove the 60s. There was hope for humanity. That was just all over the place. It drove everything. The hope for humanity, the hope of Kennedy and the hope of Martin Luther King. It gave people the sense that era, not just the Butterfield Band and the music and the jam session, but the whole idea that people would come together to create something new and to be in search of a deeper spiritual experience.
Thank you for listening to CLE Rocks. Audio and interviews were provided by Getty Images, as well as interviews conducted by cleveland.com. For more on CLE Rocks, visit our page on Acast or go to cleveland.com/podcasts. I'm Troy L. Smith. Until next time.